The words came slow, laced with something sharper than silk. A promise or a sentence, she could not tell. His hand hovered near her wrist, close enough to feel the heat without the touch, and the air between them thickened like smoke before flame. She did not pull away. She could not. Around them, the hall held its breath, waiting for her to shatter or to stand. But all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, wild and disobedient, louder than any accusation they could speak. Before we sink into the story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Underscore, 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 underscore. She had learned early that silence was safer than speech, that stillness drew less cruelty than movement. The stone walls of the manor held no warmth, only the memory of it. Faint traces of laughter that belonged to others, echoes of footsteps that never descended to where she slept. Her room was not a room but a repurposing, a storage chamber beneath the main staircase, where light entered only through a crack near the ceiling, thin as a scar. She woke each morning to the sound of boots above her head, the rhythmic percussion of a household that had learned to step over her existence without stumbling. The Matrona, she could not bring herself to use the word stepmother, for it implied some form of relation, some thread of care, ruled the estate with a precision that felt almost surgical. Every curtain hung at the exact angle. Every servant knew their place by heart. And she, the daughter born of the first wife, the one whose body had grown in directions the world deemed inconvenient, had been assigned her place long ago, out of sight, out of mind, out of the light that might reveal her to guests who mattered. She did not remember her father's face, only his absence, a shape that had once filled doorways, a voice that had once spoken her name. After he passed, the Matrona had wasted no time. Within a season, the portraits were replaced, the gardens replanted, the staff retrained. It was as if the house itself had agreed to forget. And she, the living proof of what came before, became the one flaw the Matrona could not renovate away. So she was hidden, not with locks or chains, but with silence and shame, the kind that seeps into your skin until you begin to believe you deserve the dark. Her days folded into one another like pages of a book no one would read. She woke before dawn to lay the fires in rooms she would never inhabit. She scrubbed floors on her knees, her back aching, her hands raw and red. The other servants did not speak to her unless necessary. It was not malice, exactly. It was something colder, indifference, the kind born of instruction. The Matrona had made it clear. The girl was a charity case, a burden carried out of duty. To befriend her was to question the order of things. And no one questioned the Matrona. But she had a window, a sliver of sky visible from the narrow space where she slept. At night, when the house finally stilled, she would press her face close to the cold stone and watch the stars. They were distant, unreachable, but they were hers. No one could take them. No one could tell her she was unworthy of their light. In those moments, she felt something she could not name, a flicker, faint as a candle in wind, but persistent. A whisper that said she was more than the sum of her confinement. The day the invitation arrived, the house erupted into motion. A ball, a gathering of the highest families in the region. The Matrona moved through the halls like a conductor, orchestrating every detail with manic intensity. Dresses were commissioned, musicians hired, the silver polished until it gleamed like captured moonlight. She watched it all from the periphery, invisible as always, her hands busy with tasks no one would remember. Carry this. Clean that. Stay out of sight when the guests arrive. But the Matrona had not accounted for one thing, the guest of honor. His name was spoken in whispers, as if to say it too loudly might summon him prematurely. Lord Ashenmere. Some called him the Pale Duke. Others, in darker tones, used a word that belonged to old stories and older fears. Vampire. No one said it outright, but the word hung in the air like incense, heavy and unavoidable. He was ancient, they said, powerful beyond measure. His arrival could elevate a house or destroy it, depending on what he found. The Matrona saw opportunity. A connection to Lord Ashenmere would secure her position, erase any lingering doubts about her legitimacy. She prepared the estate as if for a coronation, every surface scrubbed, every light placed just so. And she made one thing abundantly clear, the girl was to remain below. Locked away, Hidden. Nothing could risk ruining this night. Nothing could remind the guests that the house held secrets better left unspoken. The evening of the ball, she was sent to the cellar. Not the storage room where she usually slept, but deeper still, a place where the air smelled of earth and old wine, where the walls wept with moisture and no sound from above could penetrate. The Matrona herself turned the key, her expression unreadable. "Stay here," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "Do not make a sound. Do not try the door." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading, and the girl was alone in a darkness so complete it felt like drowning. She sat on the cold floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, and listened to the silence. It was not empty. Silence never is. It was full of the things she could not say, the questions she could not ask. Why was she born into a body the world despised? Why was her existence treated as a mistake to be corrected, a stain to be hidden? She had done nothing wrong. She had been nothing but obedient. And still she was here, buried alive in her own home. Time lost meaning. She did not know how long she sat there. Minutes. Hours. The darkness pressed against her eyelids, thick and suffocating. She thought of the stars. She thought of the window. She thought of all the small freedoms she had carved out in the margins of her captivity, and she felt them slipping away, dissolving like salt in water. Perhaps this was how it would end. Perhaps she would simply fade, forgotten, until even she could not remember her own name. Then, faint and far above, she heard it. Music. The sound of violins, delicate and mournful, threading through the stone. Laughter. The clink of glasses. The murmur of voices blending into a single, indistinct hum. Life. Happening without her. She closed her eyes and let the tears come, silent and hot, because no one was there to see them, and because she had learned long ago that crying changed nothing. But something else was happening above. Something the Matrona had not anticipated. Lord Ashenmere had arrived. He entered the ballroom like winter itself, a cold front that stilled the air and dimmed the candles. Tall, impossibly so, with a presence that seemed to occupy more space than his body required. His skin was pale, not the pallor of illness, but of something untouched by time, smooth and flawless as carved marble. His eyes, dark, fathomless, moved across the room with the patience of something that had seen centuries pass and had learned not to hurry. He did not smile. He did not need to. His existence was statement enough. The Matrona curtsied low, her practiced grace on full display. She spoke of honor, of tradition, of the deep respect her house held for his lineage. He listened without expression, his gaze drifting past her to the assembled guests, the painted faces, the glittering jewels, the carefully constructed facade of wealth and breeding. He saw through it all. He always did. Then, in the middle of the Matrona's carefully rehearsed speech, he stopped. His head tilted, just slightly, as if he had heard something no one else could perceive. A note out of place, a rhythm interrupted. He turned, slowly, his eyes scanning the room, the walls, the floors. The guests watched, confused, as he took a step toward the far corner, where a narrow servant's passage led to the lower levels. "There is someone missing," he said. His voice was low, soft, but it carried through the hall with unnatural clarity. Every conversation ceased. Every eye turned to him. The Matrona's smile faltered. "My lord, I assure you, all the guests of importance are present." "I did not say a guest," he replied, his gaze fixed on the shadows. "I said someone." And in that moment, deep below, locked in the dark, the girl felt something shift. A pull, a recognition, as if someone, somewhere, had finally remembered she existed. The Matrona's composure cracked, just barely, a hairline fracture in porcelain. Her hands, which had been resting elegantly at her sides, clenched into the fabric of her gown. She laughed, a sound like glass scraping against stone, and gestured broadly to the room. "My lord, you honor us with your presence, but I fear you've been misinformed. This house holds no secrets, no hidden souls. Everyone who belongs here stands before you." Lord Ashenmere did not move, did not blink. His stillness was more unnerving than any motion could have been. "I did not say hidden," he murmured, his eyes still fixed on that distant corner, that shadowed passage. "I said missing. There is a difference." The guests shifted, uncomfortable. Whispers began to thread through the crowd like smoke. The musicians had stopped playing, their instruments frozen mid-phrase. Even the candle seemed to burn lower, as if the air itself had thinned. The Matrona opened her mouth to protest again, but something in his gaze stopped her. It was not anger. It was knowing. The kind of knowing that stripped away pretense and left only truth, raw and unavoidable. He began to walk. Not quickly, but with the inevitability of water finding its level, of gravity pulling stone downward. The crowd parted before him without being asked. His footsteps made no sound on the marble, yet everyone heard them anyway, felt them, like a pulse in the floor itself. He moved toward the servants' passage, and the Matrona followed, her face pale now, all her careful planning unraveling with each step he took. "My lord, please," she said, her voice pitched higher than before, desperation bleeding through the practiced refinement. "There is nothing down there but storage. Old things we no longer use. It would be beneath your—" "Show me." 2 words, spoken without emphasis, without threat, but they carried the weight of centuries, of power that did not need to announce itself. The Matrona stopped walking. Her mouth opened and closed, wordless. Around them, the guests watched with a hungry fascination of those who sense scandal brewing, who smell blood in the water. One of the servants, an older man who had served the house since before the Matrona arrived, stepped forward. His hands trembled as he produced a ring of keys from his belt. He would not meet the Matrona's eyes. He had been there, after all, when the first wife lived. He had seen the child grow. He had watched her be erased, piece by piece, and had said nothing. Perhaps this was his penance. Perhaps he was simply tired of carrying the weight of silence. The door opened with a groan, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The smell that rose from below was damp and close, the scent of earth and neglect. Lord Ashenmere descended without hesitation, and after a moment, the Matrona followed, her skirts rustling against the walls. Behind them, the guests crowded at the doorway, craning their necks to see, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. Below, in the cellar, the girl heard the footsteps approaching. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape. She stood, her legs shaking, her back pressed against the far wall. She did not know what was coming. She knew only that something had changed, that the careful architecture of her imprisonment was shifting, cracking, preparing to collapse. The key turned in the lock. The door swung open. And there, framed in the doorway with lamplight spilling around him like a halo of fire, stood a figure, so pale he seemed to glow. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply looked at each other across the small space, he, ancient and impossible, she, young and forgotten. 2 forms of exile recognizing each other in the dark. Lord Ashenmere's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of something that might have been surprise, or recognition, or a memory of a feeling he had thought long dead. He saw her, not her body, not the flesh the world had deemed excessive or wrong, but the person beneath. The soul that had learned to live in margins and shadows. The strength it took to survive unseen. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice, in the confined space, was almost gentle. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. She had not spoken her own name aloud in so long she feared she might have forgotten it. Behind Lord Ashenmere, the Matrona appeared, her face twisted with something between rage and panic. "She is no one," the Matrona said quickly. "A ward, a charity case, my late husband's. I asked her." Lord Ashenmere did not turn, did not look away from the girl. "Not you." The girl swallowed. Her throat was dry, her tongue thick, but she forced the words out, syllable by syllable, like pulling thread through stone. "Eleanor," she whispered. "My name is Eleanor." He repeated it, not as a question, but as a confirmation, as if placing it somewhere in his mind where it could not be lost again. "Eleanor." Then, still watching her, he spoke to the Matrona without turning. "You will explain to me why this person, this Eleanor, was locked in your cellar during a celebration held in her own home." Her home! The Matrona's voice rose, shrill now, all pretense of composure abandoned. "This is my home. I am the lady of this house. She is nothing. She has no claim, no right to. She is her father's daughter." Lord Ashenmere's words cut through the air like a blade through silk. "Which makes this as much her home as yours. More, perhaps, since her blood built these walls long before you arrived." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The Matrona's face went from pale to bloodless, her hands shaking at her sides. She had miscalculated. She had thought him a potential ally, a source of power she could tap into. She had not realized that power, true power, does not ally itself with cruelty. It simply observes and judges. Lord Ashenmere extended his hand toward Eleanor. Not commanding, not demanding. Offering. Will you come upstairs? Eleanor stared at his hand. It was pale, the fingers long and elegant, the nails perfectly shaped. It looked like something carved from ivory, cold and perfect. She did not know what would happen if she took it. She did not know what waited for her above. But she knew, with a certainty that burned in her chest, that this moment was a threshold. That whatever came next would define not just this night, but everything after. She reached out. Her hand, rough from work and marked with small scars, looked almost absurd next to his. But when their fingers touched, she felt no cold, only warmth. A warmth that spread up her arm and into her chest, thawing something she had not realized was frozen. He led her up the stairs. The Matrona tried to block the way, tried to protest, but he moved past her as if she were merely air. They emerged into the ballroom, and the crowd fell back, their faces reflecting shock, confusion, a dawning horror at what they were witnessing. Eleanor wanted to shrink, to disappear, to return to the safety of invisibility. But Lord Ashenmere's hand held her steady, and she found herself walking forward, step by step into the light. She had never been in this room before, had only glimpsed it from doorways, through cracks, in stolen moments. Now she stood at its center, beneath the chandeliers that dripped crystal light, surrounded by people in silk and velvet who stared at her as if she were a ghost made flesh. She felt the weight of their judgment, the revulsion some could not hide, the pity others offered like scraps. But she also felt Lord Ashenmere beside her, solid and immovable, and she drew strength from that. "This is Eleanor," he said to the room, his voice carrying to every corner. "Daughter of the house, hidden away like shame, locked in darkness while you danced above her head." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. "I wonder how many of you knew, how many of you saw her, in passing, and said nothing. How many of you chose comfort over conscience?" No one answered. No one could. The truth was too heavy, too damning. They had known. Perhaps not all of them, perhaps not consciously. But they had known something was wrong, something was missing. And they had chosen not to look too closely. The Matrona found her voice, though it came out strangled, desperate. "This is absurd. She is cared for. She has a roof over her head, food to eat. I have done my duty, more than my duty, keeping her when I could have." "When you could have what?" Lord Ashenmere turned to face her fully now, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Cast her out entirely? Erased her completely? You speak of duty as if it absolves cruelty, as if providing the bare minimum to survive is the same as allowing someone to live." The Matrona's mouth worked soundlessly. Around them, the guests began to murmur, their voices rising like a tide. Some defended her, citing tradition, citing the natural order of things. Others fell silent, their eyes sliding away from Eleanor's face, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had always believed. That some bodies were meant for display and others for hiding. That some lives mattered and others were merely footnotes. Eleanor felt herself trembling, not from fear now, but from something else. Something that felt like rage, like grief, like all the years of silence, finally demanding to be heard. She had spent so long making herself small, folding into corners, apologizing for taking up space. But here, in this room full of people who had ignored her suffering, she felt herself expanding. Not her body, her presence, her right to exist, to be seen, to be remembered. Lord Ashenmere glanced down at her, and for the first time, something like a smile touched his lips. It was faint, barely there, but she caught it, a recognition passing between them. He released her hand, and she understood. This was her moment, her choice. He had opened the door, but she had to step through it herself. She turned to face the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but in the heavy silence it carried. "I am not asking for pity," she said. "I am not asking to be saved. I am simply asking to be seen, to be acknowledged, to exist in my own home without shame." Some of the guests looked away. Others nodded, barely perceptibly, as if granting permission they had no right to withhold. The Matrona stood frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She had built her power on the invisibility of others, on the silence of those deemed unworthy. And now that silence had been broken. Lord Ashenmere addressed the room once more. I came here tonight expecting the usual performance, wealth parading as virtue, cruelty disguised as propriety. I was not disappointed. His gaze swept across them, and several guests flinched as if struck. But I also found something unexpected. Someone who has survived in spite of you, not because of you. That is worth more than all the gold in your coffers, all the titles on your walls. He turned to Eleanor. You are free to stay or to leave. The choice is yours. But know this, you owe nothing to anyone here. Not gratitude, not obedience, not silence. Eleanor looked at the Matrona, at the woman who had taken her father's name, his house, his legacy, and had tried to erase the one piece of him that remained. The woman who had taught her that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that her very existence was a burden to be borne. For years, Eleanor had believed it, had internalized that shame until it became part of her skeleton, the architecture that held her upright. But looking at her now, Eleanor felt something shift. The Matrona was not a monster. She was simply small. Small in spirit, in heart, in the capacity for compassion. She had chosen fear over kindness, control over connection. And in doing so, she had imprisoned herself far more effectively than she had ever imprisoned Eleanor. I will stay, Eleanor said quietly. The Matrona's head snapped up, hope flaring in her eyes. But Eleanor continued, not because this is your home. Because it is mine. My father built these walls. My mother walked these halls. Their memory lives here, and I will not let you erase it completely. The Matrona's face contorted. You cannot. She can. Lord Ashenmere's voice was final. And she will. You will provide her with proper quarters. She will eat at the family table. She will be treated as what she is, the rightful heir of this house. If you cannot manage that, then perhaps it is you who should consider other arrangements. The weight of his words settled over the room like snow. No one moved. No one argued. To defy him was to risk more than social standing. It was to risk something deeper, something primal. The Matrona knew this. She nodded once, sharply, her face a mask of barely contained fury. But she nodded. The ball did not resume. Guests began to leave, murmuring excuses, their eyes averted. The musicians packed their instruments. The servants moved through the room, extinguishing candles, gathering glasses. The performance was over. The illusion had shattered, and in its place was only truth, uncomfortable and unavoidable. Lord Ashenmere remained until the last guest had departed. Then he turned to Eleanor, who stood alone in the center of the now empty ballroom, looking smaller somehow in the vast space, yet more solid than she had ever been. You were brave tonight, he said. I was terrified, she admitted. Yes, that is what makes it brave. They stood in silence for a moment, the candles burning low around them, casting long shadows across the marble. Eleanor wanted to thank him, but the words felt inadequate. He had not saved her. He had simply seen her, and in seeing her, had made it impossible for others to look away. Will you return? She asked. He considered this. Perhaps, when winter comes again. I find this house interesting now. Because of a scandal. Because of you. He said it simply, without flourish or romance. A statement of fact. And somehow that made it more powerful than any declaration could have been. He bowed to her then, a formal gesture, the kind reserved for equals. And then he was gone, moving through the shadows as if he were part of them, leaving only the faint scent of cold air and old earth in his wake. Eleanor stood alone in the ballroom. Above her, the chandeliers swayed slightly, crystals chiming against each other like distant bells. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold but from the strange, overwhelming sensation of being visible, of taking up space without apology. It felt foreign. It felt frightening. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been allowed to enter. The days that followed were difficult. The Matrona obeyed Lord Ashenmere's commands, but only barely. Eleanor was given a room on the second floor, not the best room, but no longer the cellar. She was allowed at meals, though the Matrona rarely spoke to her. The servants watched her warily, uncertain how to treat someone who existed in the space between family and servant, neither fully one nor the other. But Eleanor did not shrink back. She had learned something that night in the ballroom, something that Lord Ashenmere's presence had taught her. Power was not always loud. It was not always violent. Sometimes power was simply the refusal to disappear, the insistence on existing, fully and completely, even when the world would prefer you didn't. She began to explore the house, not as a servant, slipping through shadows, but as someone with a right to be there. She found her father's study, untouched since his death, covered in dust. She found her mother's garden, overgrown but still blooming in wild, defiant patches. She found pieces of herself scattered through the house like breadcrumbs, waiting to be gathered. And at night, she no longer looked at the stars through a crack in the wall. She opened her window wide and let the cold air pour in, let it fill her lungs, let it remind her that she was alive, that she had survived. That survival, in itself, was a form of victory. Winter came, as he had said it would. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, soft and silent, covering the grounds in white. Eleanor stood at her window, watching the flakes drift down, and she thought she saw a figure at the edge of the tree line. Tall, still, watching. She did not wave, did not call out, but she smiled, just slightly, and after a moment, the figure turned and disappeared into the white. He had come back. Not to save her again, she did not need saving, but to witness, to remember, to ensure that the world did not forget what it had tried, so hard to hide. The Matrona left the following spring. No announcement was made, no explanation given. She simply packed her things and departed, her face set in bitter lines, her eyes refusing to meet Eleanor's. Perhaps she could not bear to live in a house where she was no longer the unquestioned authority. Or perhaps she simply could not stand the daily reminder of her own cruelty, reflected back at her in Eleanor's continued existence. Eleanor did not stop her, did not plead for her to stay, or curse her departure. She simply watched from the window as the carriage pulled away, feeling neither triumph nor grief. Only a quiet sense of completion, a chapter closing, a door shutting on a life that no longer served her. The house became hers, truly hers, in the way that places become ours not through ownership but through presence. She filled it with light, opened the curtains the Matrona had kept perpetually drawn, invited the servants to speak freely, to laugh, to exist as people rather than shadows. Slowly, carefully, she transformed the house from a mausoleum into a home. She never married, never sought the kind of life that society expected of women in her position. Instead, she carved out something entirely her own, a quiet existence marked by small joys and simple freedoms. She read books from her father's library. She tended her mother's garden. She learned to paint, filling canvases with color and light, teaching herself to see beauty not in spite of the darkness she had known, but because of it. Lord Ashenmere visited occasionally. Never announced, never expected. He would simply appear at twilight, standing at the edge of the garden, and she would bring him tea that he never drank. They would sit in comfortable silence, two exiles who had found in each other not romance, but recognition, an understanding that some bonds exist outside the realm of words, in the space where one soul acknowledges another. Years passed. Eleanor's hair began to show threads of silver. Her hands, which had once been soft, grew strong from working the soil of her mother's garden. She became a fixture in the house, no longer the hidden daughter, but the lady who lived there, the woman with the quiet voice and the knowing eyes. People in the village spoke of her with a mixture of respect and unease. She was different, they said, not like other women, but she was kind, and kindness, they learned, could be its own form of power. On her 40th birthday, Eleanor stood in the ballroom where her life had changed. It was empty now, as it usually was. She had no use for grand parties, for performances of wealth and status. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, she came here to remember, to honor the girl she had been, locked in darkness, counting heartbeats, to thank her for surviving long enough to become the woman she was now. The door opened. She turned, expecting a servant, and found instead the familiar pale figure of Lord Ashenmere. He looked exactly as he had 20 years before, unchanged, unchanging. Time touched him differently, if at all. "I heard it was your birthday," he said. "You keep track." "I keep track of important things." He crossed the room to stand beside her, both of them looking out at the empty dance floor, the dormant chandeliers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Staying here. You could have left, built a new life somewhere else." Eleanor considered this. "No," she said finally. "This place tried to bury me. I chose to bloom here instead. That matters. It matters that the walls that witnessed my suffering now witness my joy. It matters that I took back what was meant to be mine." He nodded slowly. "You were always stronger than they knew." "No," she corrected gently. "I became strong because they tried to make me weak. There is a difference." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Lord Ashimere reached into his coat and withdrew something, a small package wrapped in dark cloth. He handed it to her without ceremony. Inside was a mirror. Small, handheld, the frame carved from dark wood and inlaid with silver. The glass was old, slightly warped, but when Eleanor looked into it, she saw herself clearly. Not the girl who had been hidden away, not the body that had been deemed wrong, but the woman she had become. Whole, present, undeniable. "So you always remember," Lord Ashimere said quietly, "what I saw that night, what I still see, not what others told you to be, but what you are." Eleanor's throat tightened. She gripped the mirror carefully, as if it might shatter. "Thank you," she whispered. He inclined his head. Then, as always, he departed, melting into the gathering dusk, leaving her alone with her reflection and the echo of his words. Eleanor returned to her room and placed the mirror on her dresser, where the morning light would catch it, and every day after, when she woke, she looked into it, not to judge or criticize, but to remember, to witness herself the way he had witnessed her, with honesty, with recognition, with the understanding that existence itself, in defiance of those who wished you erased, was its own quiet revolution. The house stood for many more years. Long after Eleanor's hair turned fully silver, long after her hands grew too weak to tend the garden alone. She hired others to help, young people from the village who needed work, who needed a place where they would be seen. And she taught them, without words, what she had learned. That survival was not just endurance. That sometimes the most radical act was simply to remain, to exist loudly in spaces designed for your silence. When she died, it was in her sleep, in her room with the window open, winter wind carrying snow across the sill. They found her in the morning, peaceful, a slight smile on her lips, the small mirror still clutched in her hand. The staff wept, the village mourned. And far away, in a place where darkness gathered thick and ancient, Lord Ashimere paused in his endless wandering and turned his face toward the house where a light had just gone out. But it was not gone. Not really. Because Eleanor had learned the secret that all exiles eventually discover, that we are remembered not by monuments or grand gestures, but by the small, stubborn ways we refuse to vanish, by the doors we open for others, by the light we insist on bringing into darkness, even when the darkness insists we belong there. Her house became a refuge, her story a whispered legend. And though her name faded from official records, though no portrait hung in the halls to commemorate her, she lived on in the way all important things do, in the lives she touched, in the silence she broke, in the fundamental, irrevocable truth that she had been there, that she had mattered, that she had been seen. And on winter nights, when the snow fell soft and the wind carried voices from the past, people swore they could see two figures in the garden, one tall and pale, the other smaller, softer, walking together through the white, two shadows that had found each other in the dark and had chosen, against all reason, to remember. Yenny, if the story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what most makes us human.